Hello everybody, welcome to the Creator Space Masterclass Cinematography. So just sorry for a bit of the delay, we're just having some hookup issues with internet services, but we're here and we're really excited to be bringing this masterclass start. So this is going to be, there's 4 different sessions. They're recorded. Eventually we'll have them all on our YouTube channel, so that's the good news. So you're here joining us live, but you'll be able to also see us, this session that you're at, this same link you can rewatch right after as well. So sit back, enjoy, and we're gonna go from here. So my name is Tom Strand. I'm the lead digital artist of the Creator Space project, and I'm really happy that you can join us here today. So in terms of our who we have on our project, all of our partners in this project, so we have the Canada Council for the Arts, then we have our library partners, Blue Mountains Public Library, Collingwood Public Library, and the Wasaga Beach Public Library. Now the great thing is our library partners, this is where you can access equipment. So for example, I'm demonstrating on the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera, and you can access these at the Blue Mountains Public Library and the Wasaga Beach Public Library. So that's the really good news, is that you can access this equipment directly. So today we're going to be talking about composition, and as I mentioned, this will be, there's a 4-part series. So this is going to happen for the next 4 Wednesdays, and you'll be able to join us live or watch the recordings after. So either way, get a ticket, and then you can choose what works best for your schedule. We're always taking questions too, so if you have any questions, comments, ideas, topics you want to have us consider and look at or introduce during this too, just email me tom@tbmcs.ca. I'd be happy to go over things. So now in terms of what we're going to do today, we're going to look at what is composition and really explore that idea. Composition, what it means, and image composition versus framing, shot sizes, all the different perspectives of how we can work on our composition. So it's kind of an exploration of how we can improve our composition. And I think that's always the really interesting thing, because it's not just a fixed thing. And I think we'll learn that is that composition in digital cinema is a evolving situation. So you're moving the camera potentially, and we have a movement session coming up, so make sure to join us. That's next week. But you're moving the camera and the image, so you're reframing. And that's what we'll hear too. Sometimes you hear that term framing. And the idea is, if you think of composition, it's really important if you understand the roots. And we're going back to painting and composition and painting. And really framing is like, what's in your frame? What is in that frame that you're painting? Right now you see me, I'm in a frame as well. So it's always frames, the composition. Where we get out of frames we get into some more interesting things like 360 video, where all of a sudden there's no frame. The frame is where you're looking at a specific time. But even with our eyesight, we have a specific frame at any specific time where we look. We don't see everywhere. We can't see all around us. So that's always really interesting, is how you can do that. Is that, composition is the really fun thing of deciding what our audience will see. It's a certain perspective, it's a certain view looking through the camera. And based on how you do the composition, it could be, pleasing, engaging, it could create tensions, it could be annoying. Sometimes you can see something, something, but that's also, it's creating some sort of a reaction. And that's the really fun thing about these composition concepts, are that we can create actions, reactions, and things through our shots. So it's really a fun thing to get through, to explore, and to test things out. And there's really it's a never-ending process of always seeking to find better compositions and new composition ideas. So we're going to look at some of the rules, and then we're going to look at how we can practice these concepts and how we can go from there. So some of the rules and ideas we'll go through, and then we'll get into like a demo with the camera setup, and just to see the different types of compositions we can do. And again, there's really no limit. So if you can think of things. And that's kind of the role in digital cinema, is we're always looking at trying to find new ways of telling the stories, different angles, different composed shots to tell the story. And every time you see something new and fresh, you can react to it too and say, oh. But also, when you see things that are classically composed, there's something that works really well about them versus something that could be, a little bit more on the on the loose side, or maybe it's a bit of an error and it's not working so well. Now, like how I'm sitting here right now, this is really classical in a way too. It's not necessarily, I wouldn't say, maybe artistic composition, but this kind of center composition. I'm here in the middle, you see me, and that works really well. So, if you're ever stuck in creating composition, that center composition, can always work quite well. And it's not a bad thing. It's not the best composition. It's not the most aesthetically pleasing composition, but this kind of centered type of composition can be your go-to. If, in a documentary, if you're shooting something live, sometimes there isn't a lot of time to think and you're just trying to get these shots as fast as possible. At least if you're centered, that's not such a bad thing. But we'll look at how to do a little bit better than just being centered like what we're seeing right now. Okay, so what is composition? Let's get right into that. Composition is the method of composing or creating an image. So, I'm kind of putting that word back in there. But that's the whole thing, is if you start to think about, how do you compose something? So that's, if you look at music, you're creating things through different notes and you're deciding how everything works together to compose something. That's how we deal with composition too, is that we have multiple aspects that put together create the total image. And these aspects are, where our subject is, layers, what, kind of focus we have. Is everything in focus? Or is there a shallow focus, specific focus? Where are things light and dark? And all of this plays into this idea of composition. So it's not just necessarily framing, but we want to start thinking of it as all the aspects and layers that together create our final frame. So that could be, again, a pool of light that shines onto the subject. It could be, a specific focus on the subject, that we only see a little bit of things in focus. And, that becomes really interesting, again, is what are we putting in our composition? And there's many factors. And the cool thing is that even though we've broken this down into 4 different parts, we need to always remember that in digital cinematography, all of these really work together. And they're different building blocks. And it's kind of like a Rubik's Cube, that they all come together to create, eventually, if you can solve it, that's kind of the mastering of digital cinematography. But at first, all these sides of this square, the cube, need to be thought of in terms of how to create the overall whole of the image. And it's not going to be perfect. We're not going to be able to put all the squares in the right spot and the colors on each side right away. But that's kind of our goal as cinematographers, that eventually we'll be able to fit everything into that kind of an idea. Okay, so video format, we're just going to review a few things here, just in terms of, what the video format is, and these kind of aspect ratios and things we'll look at today. And so, traditionally in the past, and if you come from a background of video, great. If you don't, just a little bit of an information session on these ideas. So standard definition is what we saw in television for the longest time, since television started, all the way through till the dawn of HD monitors. So we used to see this 4:3 image, kind of a square, 720 by 480. So, if you imagine 700 by 500 in its measurement of pixels, pretty much a square. Now we get into 1920 by 1080, and that's the full HD resolution. And what's really interesting there is that we get into the idea of, the HD now is, if you look at that, it's 2000 by 1000. So it's almost a 2-to-1 idea of aspect ratio. So we start to get into a little bit more kind of what's cinematic. And what you're watching right now, this is exactly it. 1920 by 1080, 16 by 9, right, as the ratio, which is about 1.8 to 1. So, just rough math, 2 to 1 almost. And so again, it's a little bit more cinematic, but imagine in the past, you'd be seeing this kind of square. That's the SD 720 by 480 that we used to see on those kind of square TVs. Maybe some of you still have those, right? But now we're seeing these 16 by 9, so you see this image the way it is like this. Our computers, our phones, everything is working in this kind of a widescreen aspect ratio. Now, then we get into the next evolution is 4K, and that's what our Blackmagic Pocket Cinema cameras that you can get through our library partners, that's what they can access. So those are 4K, and they can access the 4K resolution, which is 3840 by 2160. So you can see it's about 4000 by 2000 if you just kind of do the rough math. Again, keeping that 2-to-1 ratio. So just everything's doubled. So it's exactly double, 1920 times 2, 3840. right? And then the 1080 by 2 is 2160. So that's exactly what what it looks like in terms of the uh, the resolutions and the aspect ratios. Now we also have is something called the 4K DCI, and that's a Digital Cinema Initiatives package, and that is just a little bit bigger. So it's 4096 by 2160. So that's our 4K DCI. So our Blackmagic cinema camera can also work in 4K DCI. So that's if you're specifically going to a cinema release. You can see that that's more in line with a 2:1 aspect ratio, and that gives you that kind of exact cinema ratio. So just something to consider if you know where you're looking to, where you're going to have your film go to. Some people like shooting in the 4K DCI because you can always just punch in a little and make a final 4K. So that's just some ideas to throw around there and to think about as we get into our composition. Okay, so now image control in terms of our composition. So this is that idea of how do you control your image within your composition. So you're composing what's in your frame, and this is one of those classic rules. And again, rules are made to be broken in the arts for sure. But if you think of your frame as a canvas, and then you're choosing, breaking up the frame into these 3 lines. So you have, you break it down into 3 squares horizontally, 3 squares vertically. So you're drawing 2 lines vertically, 2 lines horizontally, and then the intersecting points, that's the rule of thirds. So the idea is that if you use that rule of thirds guide or as a grid, and you put your subject into the top left corner and it extends down. So let's say the head of your subject is right in that corner, and you can see it's not centered anymore, right? But the centering image where it can work is like if you look at me, I'm kind of in the 2 spots right here. So I'm kind of in the rule of thirds a little bit in terms of I'm right in the middle. It's not the worst thing. But so again, how do we improve this, right? We start to go more, if I go like this, now I have a better composition. And that's, you can see now I'm lined up here, and that's that rule of thirds idea right there, as you can see there. And that gives you the option to, you can frame left, so you can see to the left, top left, or you can frame right to the top right. You can also frame to the bottom left or bottom right. And that's kind of a very different type of composition. We don't see it all the time, but that's where you basically leave a lot of headroom. And where then the subject is really low down. So we'll look at that as well as a demo of how using that negative space. And it's kind of I would like to call it a bit of an annoying composition because you're like, why is there like so much space on the top? But it's a really interesting artistic composition that's visually can work well if there's something of importance above your subject. So for example, they're standing in front of a huge mountain. It's vertical. If you frame them in the bottom and you leave the top, that way you can actually put their heads on the bottom left or bottom right, and then the top can be the mountain in that kind of negative space. But that can help with the composition because then you're still seeing something up above. So just to think about that, I think it gets a little bit, I like to again, use that, the word annoying when you just see kind of white wall or something above. But again, it can be very effective. We see this in cinema a lot. So it's something to try. And it's kind of not the normal way of using that necessarily. We see a lot of the top left, top right. Usually the bottom ones are more of like the intersecting ideas where we see another important object. So if someone's reading something, you can see if they're in the top left and let's say their hands in their book is in the bottom right. That's a really interesting triangular composition that works well in terms of using a rule of thirds. And that's a really interesting aspect to it as well. Okay, so that's our rule of thirds. Now here's a little bit of example. This is a frame that I have from a documentary I shot. You can see if I put the intersecting grid, we have our subject right there in the top right, intersecting lines right there. And then, you can see that kind of the background is leading us, the lines are kind of going away, but they lead towards him. But that's a nice composition where he's on the right. And you can see we're observing that rule of thirds pretty closely. And it's an aesthetically pleasing image. So that would be it's a documentary still frame. So that's how that can work there. Here's another one. This one I found, I just kind of pulled the still and I was like, it actually has some interesting elements because we're using these rule of thirds. So we have top left corner, we have the soldier we have the smoke, and it's not necessarily as perfect. It could be, he should technically, his head should be more in the crosshairs there. So that would be, how to improve the shot. I would definitely do it like that. And then it kind of leads to the bottom. But look at the fence, how it goes up towards him, the lines. That's where we start to get into that more kind of advanced idea of composition. Using other lines and using perspectives or lines or the elements of the frame to help lead the eye towards our main subject. So you can see the fence draws your eye right to him, but at the same time the smoke is pushing forward. And another interesting point is on the top right, where we have the big smoke ball from the discharge is on the top right corner. So that looks really neat. That has a nice overall composition. So this has a lot of nice layers. This was happening live, recreation, filming it. There wasn't a lot of time to consider necessarily everything, but I think it works well. It just kind of goes to show that you can be doing something really quick and live, and maybe not having a lot of time to practice it through or get your exact frames. But if you're thinking, it should start to become, eventually what it does is it becomes second nature. It becomes very intuitive. It becomes just part of your mode of operation, if you will. So it becomes, just how you'd use it, how you can, utilize these tools and these concepts to your advantage as much as possible. So that could be, again, very interesting in terms of, what's possible, and once you have the shorthands, these tools, these rule of thirds, you can get a good idea of it and get composing really quickly and getting some really interesting images. So you don't have to spend a lot of time thinking it, because the last thing you want to do is spend half an hour getting some exact specific shot and hoping that it's going to work really well, and then maybe it doesn't. And so that's the whole thing, is to try to really think about what the best solution is at any given moment. And then the other thing is, like I said before, is that this camera is moving, so I'm doing moving shots on it. So this is that moment. But let's say I'm panning to the right, you have to think about what's your next kind of composition point. And you don't want to just end it off into something that's not very visually pleasing. You want to think about getting a good end composition. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, and that's the whole thing. But at least you try. And if you're trying towards that kind of composition with the rule of thirds in effect, it's not going to hurt you, because at least you're trying to achieve that, and you're looking for those. And it's hard to always find them, especially in like live events, documentaries. In drama, you can spend more time rehearsing your start and end points in camera movements. You can also spend more time specifically framing people. You can spend time moving paintings, moving, set dressing, how they're sitting, what they're sitting behind. Does the painting, seem to come out of their head? But these same ideas in your composition should be applied to even if you're doing a documentary film, because you don't want, let's say, a flower coming out of someone's back of their head in the composition. That's weird. Get that flower off to the next to the person, or maybe even remove it if it's something weird. So always think about the overall look in the composition when you're deciding your shots. Okay, so then another thing we can do is we can start to look at the different shot sizes, and those can help with our composition in terms of, guiding the eye, telling the story, and all this. So we can have different shot sizes. So we can have, wide shots, medium shots. So this is what we'd call a long shot. A wide shot to just help establish the location. Again, thinking about rule of thirds. So I have that tree in the foreground is hitting that rule of thirds idea on the top right. And then the other tree behind the soldier on the left it's almost hitting our left rule of thirds area. So that's kind of the intersecting point there. So we get a little bit of that. And then they're pretty much centered, but we have these lines of trees and fence that are kind of moving to the edges. So that perspective lines, it's really interesting. And then those move towards the two gentlemen. So that is helping us bring our eye to the composition. So I think there's a kind of a running motif, and as much as you can, you try to find these other lines and things that help guide the eye to the subject. And that's trying to find that most interesting image and perspective, is trying to find those other elements that could be used in terms of, guiding us through and guiding our eyes, guiding the audience's eyes where they should look at any given time. Then we get into something like this, like a medium shot where it's like waist and higher, right? Same kind of idea, just putting, making that wide shot into a medium shot. So it brings the audience closer, gives us more details, more perspectives, and that's really interesting. But again, think of our composition here. So the soldier on the left, screen left here, is looking, he's more in that perspective now of the rule of thirds to the left. And then our tree is kind of the complementing side on the other side. It's a little bit more of a center heavy image here. So again, how to perfect this a little bit more, I'd probably put a little bit more emphasis on putting these two soldiers on the screen left. So just kind of pushing them over and leaving a little bit of space on the by the tree there. Okay, so these are these extreme close-ups, they're close-ups and getting really important details. So now, again, you can see that rule of thirds, he's pulling it basically on the top left intersecting points of the rule of thirds. So that's an interesting, again, aesthetically pleasing composition, and getting close up in there. And so that's how do you decide your composition? How close do you want to be? That's the same idea as if you're doing a painting. How wide is that painting going to be? Is it going to be a really close, still life? Is it going to be a really wide landscape, right? Or is it going to be the fruit on a tree in the landscape and you're getting that real close-up perspective? So you always have to think about that's the framing idea of what the perspective is of the overall shot too. So it's not just deciding what's in the frame, it's deciding how wide or how close we want to be in the frame. And that's and it's something that's probably a little more specific to cinema, is that you can really go close with close-ups, and that's part of the cinematic language. Maybe in paintings, the idea is that it's hanging somewhere for decades or years, this painting, and you have more time to look at it, the painting. In cinema, you have shots that are coming out at you fast in the editing, and you have a little bit less time to really think about what you're seeing, and so that's the close-up is a really effective tool in cinema because it gives you that close-up quick, versus in a painting you might expect the audience to spend a little time and find those details naturally by looking at something for a while. Okay, so dramatic use. So that was kind of on the documentary side, dramatic use. So same idea here, establishing wide shot, shot size variety, really important. So look at the composition. So again, they're not centered. We're looking at having the rule of thirds, so that the actor on the right, he's right in that kind of rule of thirds. Now here's something just to criticize the composition. That's kind of the idea. I have this stuffed toy that seems to be coming out of the top of his head. So that's not really an ideal location. So I'd probably want to push that to the other side. It would be a much more ideal type of location. So that's when you go to criticize kind of your shot. So here's a medium shot, or two actors in one shot. So again, they're a little bit on the right? So trying to preserve our rule of thirds. Again, that dog is still coming out of his head. This is a comedy, so maybe that's okay. But again, how do you perfect the image? I would definitely think about that, to not have the dog coming out of his head. Here, this angle is a little bit better. So here's the close shot. Look how this is shot, he's framed right. So he's right on the right, rule of thirds intersecting. And our other actor, she's just over the shoulder, or just kind of and the focus is on him. Everything else is a bit out of focus. So we start to look at that in our composition too. How do we start, deciding what's in focus, what's not in focus, that kind of idea. Here's the reverse. So here's the close-up reverse shot. Now notice she's the direct opposite, the mirror image of his shot. So she's on the screen left, and the composition is now working towards our rule of thirds on the screen left. And this is also known as shot reverse shot, where we're featuring then the other actors' dialogue and focusing on what they say, their reactions. So you have the mirror image of the shot. Now this is really important because when you're doing these kinds of shots, you want to make sure that you're not having the actor on the right and then the other reverse shot that the person's on the right as well. You want to be mirroring them, so the person's on the right and then the person's on the left in the reverse shot. So they need to complement each other. And that's really important in your composition to help, better tell that story. And focus, this is, everything's in focus pretty much here. So this is that idea of this wide shot. Usually you have everything in focus in your wide shot, and that's what it ends up looking like. And then when you get closer, you start to get selective focus. So here you can see there's selective focus. The actors are in focus, our two characters, and the background's a bit out of focus. So that's how you start to get into the composition. Again, much more of a cinematic aspect. You don't necessarily see that in paintings where you're making things out of focus, but it could be stylized. So that's how we start to get into the the impressionists and things where the backgrounds and elements are a little bit more stylized and maybe there's more detail in something. So that's mimicking this idea of what's sharper, more details versus things that's less detailed, more stylized. And technically that's kind of like it's out of focus. So if you look at any kind of painting, start to look at that too, the composition and how potentially the painter is using this idea of depth of field or what's in focus, what's out of focus. And that's the same idea when we get into composition. So how, what's in focus, what's out of focus. And again, here, getting a lot closer, you can see just our middle ground is in focus versus the foreground of our other actor. He's out of focus and the background is out of focus. And this brings me to the next idea of foreground, middle ground, and background. So we got to think about layers in our composition. And in painting, again, if everything was in focus, we'd always have that where you'd have a little bit of the foreground, the middle ground, traditionally where our main subject area would be, and then the background, which is kind of the more distant background area. That could be, the wall, it could be a window, it could be a huge field. But the middle ground would be that kind of main area in the painting, and it kind of hovers it somewhere in the middle if you think about, where it lies. So if we go back to this image, if you look at him, he's like the first layer, the foreground. Our actor, she's in the middle. If you think of, in the depth wise too, she's kind of in the middle. And then the background is definitely way in the background. So, and you can feel that. And this is helped in cinema through this idea of selective focus in our composition. So we can have selective focus specifically on the middle ground, or we can have selective focus on the background. They could both be out of focus and the background could be in focus. It could be the foreground that's in focus. Then in our composition, we can also decide to move focus when we get into movement. So there's always that movement part because these are frames per second. This is video. It's not just a still photo or a painting. We have the ability to change our focus as well, just as we have the ability to reframe and change our shots. So I think that's the whole thing now is that, kind of leading into what we'll get into the next week is getting into that fluidity and moving cameras and moving motion and things like that. So image control, how do we get this kind of idea of what's in focus, what's out of focus? So the overall exposure is controlled through our manual lenses, in this case, through our Creator Space Access equipment. Through the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera, we use manual focus lenses. And, when they're wide open, they allow more light in. And when they're closed, they let in less light. So you need more light when it's a low light situation. You need to let less light in when you're, let's say, outside in the sun. So that's the whole idea. It's kind of like a little pinhole that closes more and more depending on, what is required, how much light is required to expose. So, and then it's measured in stops, so f-stop. So it starts usually at 1.4 or 2, and then it goes to, 2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8. And you can see the 1.4 to 2.8, that's a double, and the numbers, and it's double the amount of light, of exposure in there, double the stops, 2-stop increment, right? So that's from 1.4 to 2, 2 to 2.8. And then you can see 2.8 times 2 goes to 5.6, and 2 to 4 goes times 2, 2 times 2 is 4, and then 4 it doubles to 8. Right? So those are the numbers. It kind of represents that idea of as you're doubling into it. So again, overview, smaller the number, the more light you're letting in, it's wide open, and the higher the number, the less light you're letting in, and it's less open. right? So that's the idea between those two. Now, image control, depending on your ISO, so the smaller the ISO, you have better image detail. So that's something important too. How sharp do you want your composition? And this is something to think about. We don't always think about it with composition. It's like, okay, we're just going to have the image, but do you want grain? What do you want how do you want that image to be captured with the camera? So if I have a lower ISO, let's say 100, it has really fine details, especially this is important for more close-up shots. If I have a higher ISO, meaning that I needed to have more gain or light sensitivity to my digital image sensor, I can shoot in lower light, but I'm also going to make a little bit of noise gets added. And this chart is really useful because it takes us from 100, 400, 800. You see there's more and more grains introduced to the point that you get this kind of digital noise idea by the end when we're at 25,000, right? So you can see how it keeps going. So smaller ISO, better image plus detail, larger ISO, noise plus less detail. So that chart's really handy. It's a nice little reference. Okay, so proper exposure. Again, just what you see is what you get, and we've been really always talking about try to underexpose. You can always boost it in the color grading process versus trying to boost it later. And I think that can really help with, that idea of composition. Okay, so with the video camera, so digital cinema cameras like the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera started around 2013. It's now evolved into this 4K model. You can go 120 frames per second, different formats, frame rates, and it's really quite a nice camera. It's a small form factor. It looks like a DSLR kind of in its form factor, like a Canon 5D if you're familiar with that. So that's really the camera that we're going to be demoing with. So that's a camera. So that camera, we can actually use that. You can get that through our library partners. So again, Blue Mountains Public Library, Wasaga Beach Public Library. Just access our website, tbmcs.ca. Take a proficiency test. It's free. Take it. Go through it. It has videos you watch, and then you answer questions. It gives you a really good comprehensive overview of the camera, how to use it, all the tools, safety features, proper handling of it. And then once we see that, we approve access, and then you just take it out with your library card. It's just like taking out a book. So really exciting to be able to offer that. Okay, so let's move into our camera here. So I have this camera here set up, and this is that idea. We're going to go through some of the composition ideas now. So what can this look like, and how does this look? So one thing we can do, and I'm gonna show it in the HDMI in the monitor here. So I'm going to go to the HDMI. We can put something on that's called the grid. And put on this frame guide. Okay. And, so that's always a fun tool because that can help us understand, what it's going to look like in a different aspect ratio. So I'm taking the 16:9 aspect ratio, and now I'm going to like a 2:3:9 aspect ratio. So that's always kind of a fun thing of how that works. And we can change the frame guide, so we can go to different aspect ratios. So 2:1, 1.85. You can see it's this tiny little lines. 16:9, you don't really see anything. And 4:3, you can see this is showing me what it looks like on an old square monitor. So this is a really great tool to practice through your composition, to think about, what you can, how you can use it and what way you'd like to use it. Okay. So this is this is the lower thirds, or sorry, not the lower thirds, the rule of thirds. This grid helps us see our rule of thirds. So let's have a look at I'll take the frame guide off. So look at that. So this is our 16:9. We can turn this on. So just by going to the menu and under monitor, we can decide the grids. You can put different grids. And so you can put this on. So this is a great display thing. I prefer not to use this directly when I'm filming, but it helps to identify what our shots are. So how can we make a great rule of thirds idea? We can go right like this. So look, if I put my snowman subject right like this in the top left, that is a pretty classic rule of thirds idea. So the image is on the top left and it flows through. Alternatively, I can also go this way and put the image this way. So that's really nice and that's interesting. You know, and that can be done this way. So that's the framing it to the right. So we can do that. Now, as I mentioned, we can start to look at these kind of alternative ideas where we can frame the snowman like this. This is still using the rule of thirds, but you can see I have a lot of negative space. I have that headroom that's a little bit different. This is, you know, not a bad composition, but you want to think about why you're doing it. And it kind of puts a perspective on this snowman, you know, this stuffed toy, that it's kind of small. And maybe that's the idea. You can use it to kind of make your subject, you know, smaller, and the surrounding world kind of engulfs them. So it's really important to think about why you're doing something like this, the storytelling aspect of it, because, you know, you wouldn't want to just do it for no reason. And I think that's a really vital tool in making that work and making it work well. So same idea, I can also then take this idea here. And you can see right away by putting the snowman like this, and then I have that background, there's a light shining in the top right of our thirds points. So that's an interesting composition. So we have to think about that always, framing it up so that the composition can work in our rule of thirds. So the other thing we can do, like I said, is, you know, if we really, really want to go, this is the idea of where we just put something, you know, right in the middle. And the other thing, you know, this isn't a bad shot, but, you know, again, it's one of the, you know, not the most interesting shots so far, but it's right in the middle. So it's an effective storytelling point too. Okay, this is right center, and that could be your framing decision. So we're kind of breaking the rule in a way, but it's not, you know, it's not a bad shot. It's a good shot still, and it's a way to do a quick shot. So if there's a lot of stuff happening and you're not sure how to get a great composition, you can always go back to this. And this can work quite nicely. So where you can do that centered composition. But, you know, you can see quickly just by going like this, I get it a lot. It's a lot more interesting because then, you know, now I'm, you know, making this more of a cinematic type frame, and I'm playing with, you know, the background and the foreground. I'm deciding what's in focus. So this is that idea again where, you know, what's in focus. So, you know, my background here, or he's in focus here, and I can have some foreground too, right? So whether, you know, it's something here, that's just my hand, but you can see how we can start to have those layers, and it brings us to layers of what, you know, the foreground, middle ground, background, right? So that's a really important thing in the composition. So we can decide, we have some really good videos too. I'd encourage everyone to go to our website, tbmcs.ca. There's a ton of videos we have on depth of field and how to work on that, you know, in terms of getting everything, you know, working and controlling what's in focus, right? So that's a whole other area. Encourage you to look back at our YouTube channel where you can find, we'll probably have about 20 hours of digital cinematography workshop recordings available to watch, where we can, if that interests you, you can really get into that. But, you know, just to make an overall consideration here, so if you have your exposure, like your aperture, open up almost as wide as you can, and you have a lower ISO usually as well to be open up, you have a shallower depth of field. And if you use longer lenses, so I have a 35 millimeter, it's going to give you a shallower depth of field. If I use things like 16 millimeters or less, that has a larger depth of field, and that depth of field keeps everything in focus. So for example, if I take this and I go to, let's say ISO, you know, 2500, you know, this is now really extremely overexposed. I'm going to reduce the exposure like so, And you can start to see, I see more of the background in focus. And I can continue with that, and I can go even higher on the ISO. Let's go to 8,000. And you can see the more I close here, I'm closing the f-stop, and pretty much now my background and the foreground's in focus. So that's how we can achieve a depth of field that's a deep focus versus the shallow focus. Going back to where we had it, I'm going to go back to, let's say 400, and I'm going to open it up like so. And you can see now my focus is a lot more critical, where he's just in focus, the stuffed snowman. So that's how we can work with the shallow depth of field. And look at even here, like at the table, like this is out of focus. So it's really shallow. So only this little section is in focus, and then the rest is out of focus. So that's a really great tool for composition. Then the other thing is we can look at, different angles of composition, and then whether we want to be a bit closer. So we can always go a bit closer in here. Right, and we can make that framing specific to be a bit closer, and something like that. So that's a nice use of the rule of thirds. And again, just recapping that, we can do something like this. But you want to really think about what you'd want to put up here, because I still think this top area could really use something. But what if our foreground had some trees or something that were in the foreground? That could be interesting. Or again, if if he's in front of a mountain, that mountain can be coming out from the back, and that's a really good use of the rule of thirds. So this is really what it comes down to composition, just thinking about your middle ground, your foreground, middle ground, background, thinking about the rule of thirds, and framing accordingly, and then thinking about what you can do to lead us to this, to the subject, and thinking about what's in your background. See, I have nothing funny coming out of the stuffed snow person's head, but there could be something, and so that's where you just need to think about moving the camera. So for example, if I move the camera this way, right now I have that yellow sign coming out of the snowman's head. Maybe it looks kind of angelic, right? So I'm using the background as an effect again, but it's doing something. It's changing the image to, it's adding something there that is going to draw the audience's attention to the fact that he has his glow around the top of his head. So that's really, really key in terms of composition, is thinking about, what you're showing, how you're showing it, and what kind of elements are happening in the background. So sometimes simply just moving the camera, just by moving the camera over here, I get rid of that problem, right? And I can now frame, for example, like this. So always think about just sometimes moving your camera. You don't even have to move everything around the camera. Sometimes it's as simple as just moving your camera to the left or right to get a better composition, and to think about that. So again, use this grid if you're want to practice the rule of thirds. You access this through the menu, and you go to menu, monitor. I go to all, and then I can choose the different grids. We have a horizon, there's a crosshair one, there's a dot in the middle. So there's a lot of different ideas, and you can turn these on or off, just depending on what you want to do. So this is that horizon idea. So it's kind of that middle, or some people like using this crosshair. It lets you see what's right in the middle. So if you're doing a lot of center composition, this crosshair is really great, because then I can just say, okay, bang, he's right in the middle, and I know that's the middle. I don't have to think about it. So you might want to use the crosshair plus your thirds. And it's actually called thirds, which is great. So it's totally designed, ready to go with helping you compose using the rule of thirds. So it's a really great, robust tool, available again under monitor in the menu. You go to all, and then you hit thirds or crosshair. The other thing you want to do is just make sure that that you have the grid needs to be on or off under your settings in the LCD panel. You can turn that on or off. So it's really simple to use. You can practice all your composition, and again, practice really makes perfect in this situation, and you'll come up with a lot of interesting compositions, try different things, try, what can work in different areas of the rule of thirds, and that will only make you a better cinematographer in terms of getting that composition. So think of your foreground, middle ground, background. Do you want to use specific focus techniques to help aid that composition, and then lining up your composition so that you're using the rule of thirds as much as possible, because ultimately that rule is there for your benefit, and it will help achieve a aesthetically pleasing image. And sometimes people don't even know. You're just watching a film, you're like, wow, there's a lot of beautiful images. Look at one of your favorite films, in terms of cinematography, and you'll see that it probably uses a lot of interesting techniques to achieve some great rule of third compositions, aesthetically pleasing compositions, and to manage that idea that it helps to better tell the story if you have things that are visually easier to absorb, if you will. And again, look at sometimes a shot, if it bugs you, you're not sure, you're like, oh, it's kind of a weird shot. Think about why it's a weird shot. Think about if that's intentional, if it's a good thing, if it's a bad thing. So start critiquing the different shots you see, the composition shots you see. It will just make you a better cinematographer. So that's it for our session this week. So again, my name is Tom Strand, the lead digital artist of the Creator Space Project. I want to thank everyone for joining us. Please join us. We have these happening every Wednesday. We have 3 more sessions. Next week we'll be talking about movement and cinematography. So I hope to see you again next week, same time. And check out all of our other upcoming workshops on our website, and our YouTube channel is available there for past sessions and webinars that are recorded. So just again, want to thank all our partners in this project. So we have the Canada Council for the Arts and our library partners, Blue Mountains Public Library, Collingwood Public Library, Wasaga Beach Public Library. Be sure to check out the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera that I've been demoing with today. It's available at the Blue Mountains Public Library and Wasaga Beach Public Library. Until next week, have a great rest of the day, and all the best. Take care.